Cuba is the third and last stop of Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi's tour in Latin America that took him priorly to Venezuela and Nicaragua. Now we receive Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, the Vice Rector of the University of Tehran, who is part of the large delegation accompanying the Iranian President, and he's joining us today. We welcome Professor Marandi.
Thank you.
So it's a pleasure to receive you. Mr. Marandi, this is the first tour of President Raisi in Latin America since he took office in 2021. So it entails great significance. So why Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba in this first contact with Latin America?
I think the fact that Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, all of these are countries that have resisted imperialism, that have maintained their independence despite sanctions, brutal sanctions. This has created an affinity, a comradeship, brotherhood or sisterhood between these different countries, and these are being expanded. So ironically, what the West has done is that by sanctioning all of us, they've brought us closer to one another. And I think that is something that needs to be expanded. The closer Iran and Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, and Iran and Nicaragua come together, the more countries from Latin America can expand cooperation across West Asia, and countries like Iran can expand cooperation with Latin America. So the global South, the more we come together, the stronger their capabilities become to resist sanctions, resist imperialism, and therefore I think it's the smart thing to do for the leaders of these countries to exchange ideas and to increase cooperation.
And precisely regarding cooperation, this Latin American tour of the President Ebrahim Raisi have been a prosperous one, as his office and the governments of Venezuela and Nicaragua signed cooperation agreements, which is also expected during his visit to Cuba. So there is a future for relations between Iran and Latin America. But the main question is how those relations come to play in current geopolitics.
Well, at the historical moment that we are experiencing today, where the Western Empire is rapidly declining. There's no doubt about that. And as the global South is on the rise, taking advantage of this historical moment is key. And in the past, countries like Cuba and Iran and Venezuela and Nicaragua were very few, and other countries were afraid to cooperate with us, afraid to stand up to the United States. But now we see that the United States is having problems with other countries, countries like Russia, countries like China. India increasingly is looking in a different direction. Brazil is changing. The whole of the global South is on the move. And therefore, this moment in history is ideal for those countries who basically began this resistance to empire. The revolution in Cuba brought about the resistance, or enhanced the resistance before I was born. So at this historical moment, as the world is changing, I think it is an ideal moment for these countries to explore cooperation and to help push this change that is taking place across the globe in a better direction, and to push it more swiftly. The more we cooperate, the stronger we become, and the more problematic it becomes for the West to deal with us, especially at a time when the United States has so many problems with Russia, with China. They have less focus, and they're putting less focus on the rest of the world. So it is a very good moment for cooperation. I am personally quite optimistic about the future, even though I know that at the moment things will continue to be difficult across the globe, but the decline of hegemony and the imperial power of the United States can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I think that too. And I think that the main words here are union, are cooperation, and resistance or resilience in any case. But we have more on these topics. One of the main and most effective strategies of imperialism is political isolation, using smear media campaigns, as it had done with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua regarding human rights. And that have been the case of Iran also, targeting young audiences using gender discrimination and also women's rights as the backbone of these hostile campaigns. However, during their stay in Venezuela, President Ebrahim Raisi, as well as his wife, Iran's First Lady Yamileh Alamol-Hora, offered interviews in our Spanish headquarters, teleSUR. What does this show to the world regarding the media's issue against your nation and other progressive governments in our region?
Yes, and I think that is also a very positive move, because the United States, as you rightly pointed out, the Western media, the United States, the Europeans, like to present countries in the global South that resist the empire in a negative light. So in Iran, there's constant anti-Cuban propaganda coming from Persian language Western media, or English language media as well, anti-Venezuelan propaganda. So the same is true in Latin America and Cuba. The anti-Iranian propaganda is immense, the propaganda that comes from the West. And so by visiting these countries and by moving back and forth, officials, students, professors, journalists, all of them help break these narratives. They help break this imperial hold that the West has on global public opinion. The president's wife, the Iranian president's wife, is a professor at an important Iranian university. And actually, one of the interesting things that she said is that the trees at her university are older than the United States. And that is a fact, that Latin America, the capital of the Aztec Empire, the population was much larger than any European capital at that time before the Europeans came and destroyed it. The Iranian civilization is thousands of years old as well. And so when the West tries to create caricatures of Latin American resistance or caricatures of Iranian resistance, we have to respond to that and show that to public opinion, not to ignore them. And hopefully my presence here will also help facilitate student and academic exchanges. I'm hopeful that we can give scholarships to students from Cuba and Venezuela to come to Iran and study in Iran, so that we can also help the younger generation better understand how Western propaganda works and how that propaganda is very different from the reality. My own boss in my faculty at the University of Tehran is a woman. And ironically, a previous dean of my faculty, who was also a woman, graduated from Havana University.
So it means there is a cooperation gestating coming up in between Havana and between Iran. Also, regarding this theme, this topic, we saw in Venezuela, back in Caracas, the president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, he had a meeting, he had this forum, this conversation with the youth in Caracas. So, in this case, he came with a message from Iran. But what message does the president of Iran and yourself can take from Havana, from Caracas and Managua back to Tehran?
I think the most important thing that can be said is that, contrary to what we hear from the West and Western propaganda, that communities and civil society in Cuba and Venezuela, they thrive. These are energetic countries with an energetic youth that have a promising future. The beauty of Cuba, the beauty of Venezuela, the resources of these two countries, alongside the youth of these two countries, they can help build a much better and brighter future. And through cooperation between Iran and these countries and the global South at large, that future is more than possible. And sanctions that have made us suffer for decades, brutal sanctions from Western regimes that are the greatest violators of human rights, these will pass because the world is changing. Rising powers across the global South will create their own alternatives, their own alternative financial institutions, their own alternative resources and means for trade and cooperation. And the West, by increasingly using this terrible weapon of sanctions, they are effectively now isolating themselves. So while sanctions still hurt, I think that the resources that exist in these countries and the youth that exists in these countries and the fact that the West is on the decline, that is a sign that things will get better. So I think the message to the Iranian people is that Venezuela is alive, Cuba is alive, and the youth in these countries will have the opportunity to build a much greater future independent of Western imperialism.
So thank you for your words, thank you for these hope words, and for your time and presence here from the South.
Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure.